This is the PR Podcast, a show about how public relations helps you tell your story to the world. We talk with great PR practitioners who have the skills, creativity, and just plain savvy to get their clients noticed. Now here's your host, Jody Fisher.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the PR Podcast. I'm Jody Fisher. Thanks for joining us. Well, after last week's episode, I thought that we would do a little bit of an experiment. So we tweeted out on the Twitters that we had an opening for a guest this week, which we actually did. It was true. But I wanted to see how many smart and savvy PR people were actually paying attention. Now, don't get me wrong. The PR Podcast Twitter handle does not have a massive, hundreds of thousands of following, but we are connected with a lot of smart and savvy PR people out there who are listening to the podcast, who are interacting with on social media. And while that tweet did get plenty of retweets and likes, we actually got relatively few people who reached out and pitched themselves as a guest. And it really surprised me because I figured that I was just going to get a flood of PR people who were either pitching themselves, pitching their clients. Certainly, if I had seen that, I would have been like, yes, I have 3 people. Which one do you want? But it was a little bit surprising. And so what I just wanted to say again this week, like we say every week, one, need not be afraid of the PR Podcast. You should pitch yourself as a guest. We do a show a week, 52 weeks in a year. That's 52 new guests that we have on every year. You should be one of them, especially if you have a perspective or a story to tell, whether you're a PR person, whether you're in the news business, whether you're a reporter, whether you're an editor, whether you're a videographer. We've had terrific videographers and photographers on the PR Podcast talking about how they do their job out there in the field, back in the newsroom, the decisions that they make about coverage. So get in touch with us if you want to be a guest, and I hope you do. And certainly if you're a PR person, you should be a guest because this thing is built for you. So get in touch, send us a direct message on Twitter, get on the Facebook, send us a message. We don't bite, I promise, much. And book yourself as a guest because, like I said, this show is built for you. So speaking of the people who did reach out to us right away, and I'm so glad that they did, we're joined by not one, but 2 guests this week, and it's going to be a very special conversation. So let's get right into it. Shelley Spector is founder of the Museum of Public Relations, the world's only museum dedicated to the PR profession. And Jenny Frenkel is the museum's associate director. Together, they work to tell the story of the public relations industry, the history of the profession, and more importantly, how the profession of public relations has impacted history, especially in social movements such as civil rights, gender equality, and pride. Shelley and Jenny, welcome to the PR Podcast.
It's so wonderful to be here, Jody.
I am so glad the 2 of you reached out to us because, for one, I didn't even know that we had a Museum of Public Relations, which I think is awesome. So let's start right there. Tell us about the Museum of Public Relations and why you created it.
Well, actually, this was the idea of Edward Bernays, who is considered the father of public relations. And I expect that most people who are listening right now will have heard of Edward Bernays. He had a public relations firm starting in 1919 with his wife, Doris Fleischman. And my husband and I got to be good friends with him for the last 10 years of his life. And he died when he was 103 and a half. But before he died, he asked my husband Barry and I, would we create a museum of public relations in New York? And how do you say no to that, right? How do you say no to a 103-year-old man who happens to be the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, right? It's impossible to turn that opportunity down, even though my husband and I had no idea what to do with the museum. He's a graphic designer, I was a PR person, still am, and we just figured, what the hell? And it turned out to be one of the greatest things that we've ever done in our lives. It's just so incredibly rewarding.
So let's get the plug. I was going to say, let's get the plug right up front. Where is it? How do we find it?
Okay, so the museum is situated at 85 Broad Street. And but obviously for the last year and a half, we've been operating primarily online. So we have a website that has exhibits on it. We have lots of Facebook activity, which tells a lot about history and public relations. I mean, the intersectionality of PR and history is something that hasn't been done a whole lot, right? But when people hear about it, they get very interested in it. It's a deeper way of looking at PR than we typically do.
That sounds terrific. And Jenny, you were gonna tell us a little bit about the museum as well.
Yeah, the museum is it's a wonderful place that not only collects stories but shares them too, and allows for room for new stories that haven't been heard before. And that's the idea of it, is to bring forward or elevate stories that are so important to not just us but to people that might not be represented well within the industry or within history. And definitely, once I came across the museum, I felt much closer to PR because I knew about a history. I knew that there was something to look back on, to learn, to use as reference for what we do today.
So give us a little taste of what's in the museum. Do we trace it back to an origin point? What was the beginning of public relations? Was it Moses coming down the mountain with the tablets, or what was it?
No, it was Moses walking up the mountain because, God was calling him and he brought up a tablet. And God says, bring up a thing to carve in, and he brings up a slab of stone. He didn't bring up a tablet like an iPad, of course. And God is ranting and raving about how badly the Jews are behaving since they left Egypt. And so, Moses is saying, well, what the hell do you want me to do? And God says, okay, take this down. And so he goes and he, writing as fast as he can. Remember, Moses has to carve everything into the stone. And at one point, Moses looks up and says, God, he may not have called him God, he may have called him something else. God, can we just boil this down into 10 talking points? And that was the beginning of PR.
Oh, that's so great. That's so great. I was going to say that Moses coming down the mountain was the first PR stunt.
Well, that could have been, no, the stunt was really the bush on fire and,
Very good. Right,
the
exactly.
Red Sea parting. And, God wanted Moses to go out and to talk to the press. But, remember, Moses had a speech impediment. He says, my brother Aaron should do that. I'm going to hire him as my spokesman. So Aaron goes and brings the 10 Commandments, which he decided to call it because it was catchy, and bring it out to the Palestine Journal and to the Galilee Gazette and, the Canaan Chronicle. And they didn't have television back then, of course, but.
Oh, they didn't? I thought it was just black and white.
No, that was a few years after that. So that's the story that I tell. And the reason for it is to give people a sense of public relations is not just the way we know it the past century. Public relations has actually been around since there was civilization, right? If you look back, for instance, at the Egyptian civilization, they had to have had internal communications because there were thousands of people who were erecting those pyramids, right? How did they get word to one another, right? And they used hieroglyphics a lot, that was a language. They drew pictures in the town square to communicate what was going on. They built whoever built the highest pyramid or the best looking tomb, this was for their reputation. This was all, kind of corporate identity from back then. So if you use a public relations lens to look at world history and civilization, you come away knowing a lot more about public relations.
Is that what you mean when you refer to as the hidden history of PR?
No, not at all.
Oh,
Jenny,
okay,
why don't
fine.
you explain what that is?
Hidden history is bringing forward pioneers that might not have been known as PR professionals. We do know that PR offices started up in the 1910s in New York, and there are people that were activists before that. There are people that, like Shelley mentioned, from way back when, in the early civilizations, that use PR tactics and strategies. But we really highlight diverse voices within PR history. And that's the hidden history. So bringing forward any Black PR pioneers, any Latino PR pioneers, and we're constantly finding new pioneers. And it's just, that's such a beautiful, piece of work for us, that we can highlight folks within history that people in the industry today can relate to. And then we translate that into our diversity events, which have gone virtual in the last year. And it allows for people to feel comfortable with sharing their story on our platform because they know that it's a safe space. So that's been very, very fun to work on.
That's fantastic. And I know that you have, as you said, lots of events at the museum that have transitioned to online. And right now you've got a recent event that's on your website called The Role of Communicators. But it was tied into AAPI month, Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Do you do a lot of events like that? And have you done in the last year a lot of events that you've transitioned online that sort of take on sort of a current events kind of a flavor?
Well, we've had many events about crisis communications, obviously, in relation to COVID. We did research on the history of pandemic communications. So it was interesting at the beginning of COVID, a lot of us were talking, well, how did the government communicate to its citizens during the 1918 flu? Or did it? And, how was all that communicated on a local level? And we did a lot of research on that. And we wrote a paper on the history of pandemic communications. And that was very, very popular and did lots of lectures and events over the course of the year about that subject. We have a lot of diversity events tied into the heritage months, right? So we have Black PR history, right? We have Latino PR history. We have a women's PR history, but we call it PR Women Who Made History, right? So there we can talk about social activists, right? We just recently had our Asian American Pacific Islander event, the role of communicators with all this Asian hate and violence going on. What can communicators do to stop it? And then next week, or next 2 weeks, on June 29th, we'll have our 3rd annual Pride event.
That all sounds fantastic. Let's drill down on that a little bit, what you said about the role of communicators. Typically when we talk about the job of a public relations professional, it's articulating someone else's story, right? It's figuring out a way to take someone else's story or what they're doing or et cetera, and fashion it in a way that is attractive to the media that we want to tell that story through. But is there a larger role for a public relations professional in today's world? Do we have an opportunity or even a calling to do a little bit more than that?
I think so. I think we spend too little time advocating for ourselves, especially in the Asian American group. They realized, well, hell, it was just as you said, they are professional communicators, and it's time that they speak out. It's time for them to go on social media and talk about what was the genesis of this hate and violence, right? What about the Asian myths that have been going around? It's really quite a complicated story. And, more and more we have seen Asian Americans in public relations and communications be more vocal, about what they've been going through and what they can do to stop it. And during this event, which is still online, you can hear a lot of the ideas that they were coming up with on if they band together, what they can do to prevent this from happening again.
Yeah, this is really wonderful too, that all of your recent events here are listed, and I'm on your events page on your website right now. You've got an upcoming event where you can register for free. Then you've got recent events that were recorded, and you can click to watch the event, again, completely free. So this is a terrific resource for PR professionals.
We think so. Our website has been called year after year the world's #1 PR educational resource in the world. And it's amazing, you say that you never heard of the PR Museum. Well, the PR Museum is better known in India than it is in Indiana. And it's because they don't have the resources overseas that we do here. They don't have their own PR histories as well documented as we do here. So they depend on the PR history that we have on our site and as we tell through our events. So it's really become an extremely, especially during this period of time, extremely precious source of information for PR students around the world.
It's definitely reached a lot more people for sure. Yeah, it's opening up a whole new world for the museum itself. And Shelley recently spoke at a PRCA conference where her panel discussing a unified PR history. So now the museum has the opportunity, the potential to drive other PR in other countries to look back into history and help us put this together, where other industries have a unified history. You know, there's that potential now, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I think we still, however many decades after PR has been, formalized as a profession, I think we still struggle for a bit of, I'll use the word legitimacy, to really be seen as a professional who provides a very specific and valued service. And I think part of the genesis of that, and this is just me talking, is the way that we've been portrayed in modern media as these spin doctors, people who have a very loose affiliation with the truth or with facts. And just drawing back on my own personal training with Howard Rubenstein, there is no room, there is zero room for playing with facts, for messing around with the truth. You certainly can use a full throat to represent your client and articulate their message, but you never fool with the truth, and you always maintain a very high ethical standard. And I think we continue as a profession to struggle with the world's perception of us in that way. Would you agree, disagree? And how do you try to diffuse that at the museum?
That's one of the reasons that I think Bernays wanted to start the museum, was to give the legitimacy that it has been missing for all these decades. And as Bernays used to like to call the profession, it's an applied social science. So he took what Sigmund Freud was developing at the time in terms of psychoanalytic theory, and Bernays applied it to the masses, right? That's how it all began. And, that's pretty heady stuff. If you look back at the early writings of Ivy Lee, for instance, right, Walter Lippmann and Bernays and his wife, you'll see that it was an extremely well thought of profession back then. And, there were early corporate PR people like Paul Garrett of GM in the 1920s, and 1927, a fellow named Arthur Page. You may be familiar with the Arthur Page Society, and he became the first CCO of AT&T in 1927. And so these people, and you look back at them and think that they're all white guys, really laid the groundwork for the profession. But unfortunately, I think that it did lose some of its legitimacy in, perhaps a few years after World War II. I don't know exactly how that happened, but when you come into the museum, you can see the scholarship that's been put into the profession that you may not have been familiar with before. So for instance, we have a manuscript, an unpublished manuscript from 1928 from Ivy Lee that was never printed, never known about before. And we have it there on display. And if you read this, you say, this guy is brilliant, and this field is something that could really change the world in a good way.
It was so highly regarded. We have a chart from Public Relations Magazine from 1938 that is an organizational chart where it lists the chairman first, the president, and then the director of public relations. That's how significant the PR person was in 1938. So what happened?
Well, and it brings up a good point that I think we've often said, is that the public relations person or the communications person, let's just broaden it out, needs to sit very, very close to the top of the decision tree in any organization, that they cannot be 8 levels down taking orders from the people who are 6 in line to the CEO or the whoever that executive is. That you need to hear, if the CEO wants to get their message across and articulate it clearly, it's got to be whispered into the ear of the person who's going to be telling that story, and that's us. It doesn't mean that we have to get in anybody else's way, and I think that's part of sometimes corporate structures and things like that, where they think the PR guy is going to start running the show. And that's, in my opinion, that's the last thing we want to do. We don't need to make the decisions. We just want to help articulate them properly to make sure everybody's on the same page. Right?
We just want to help. We have no ill intent. We mean no harm. You hired us to help you.
Well, and there's the other thing too, boy, I'm glad you brought that up, Jenny, it's curious to me how some clients, whether you're an internal PR person or an external PR person, how some, we treat them all as clients, how they will have a communicator like us on their staff, or they're paying us a monthly retainer or what have you, and then they won't tell us stuff. And it's like, I'm the first guy you should be telling.
That's right.
Right.
Exactly. Well, I think that you could see that the companies who have the best reputation are also the companies whose CCO and president or CEO have a good relationship, where there's a strong level of trust and candor. And we saw this, in the raw during the pandemic, right? The communications function was never regarded as highly as it has been in the last 15 months.
Right. And in that case, and I don't want to start a political discussion, but I think in the last administration, the CEO thought he was the PR guy. Exactly. Which is a classic mistake, regardless of what you think of what went on or the who it was. I think it was a classic organizational mistake. The CEO thought he was also the PR guy, and you see how well that worked. Exactly.
I think that's a very good example of where things go wrong, terribly wrong, life and death wrong. Yes.
Yeah. So what do you hope that people will take away from the public relations, the Museum of Public Relations? And also, when are you reopening? Are you reopened yet, or when will you be?
Well, we have a soft opening in August. We're going to formally reopen after Labor Day for personal visits. Before COVID, we were having about 1,000 guests a year, right? And then, it's, when guests come up, they're not just in the museum itself. We have a very large classroom for them, and we do a lecture, right? And we talk about and have examples of the history of communications technologies, like old candlestick phones, old typewriters, right? Old newspapers. So we talk about these communications technologies because you can't take that apart from the history of the profession. And what we hope that they take away is a better feeling about the field, right? Or if they're still in school and they're a diverse student, they can see people who look like them throughout history. And most textbooks, as you know, only feature straight white men. But the more we do research, as Jenny alluded to, the more women we find, the more people of color, the more gay people, and even Native Americans. And so all of these people who are not straight white men have not been in the textbooks until recently. And we've been calling out to the publishers and to textbook writers, you've got to make this an inclusive history, because you're leaving out some extraordinary people who worked in civil rights or people who opened a PR firm.
Yeah, I know you wanted to mention about Pride Month and talking about the role of public relations in the gay rights movement. So I want to make sure that we hit on that as well.
Well, I think Jenny can talk about that.
Yeah, and we definitely, overall, we want folks to be empowered when walking away from anything, in any way that they interact with the museum. As long as they're empowered, we definitely did our job the right way. And with events like the Pride Month event and our previous diversity events, we want people to understand, or communicators in general, to understand that it takes a lot to listen to. You have to sit and listen to the stories that will be told on these broadcasts. And the Pride event is going to feature something different for the museum. It's going to have 2 panels, which we usually do, but the first panel will be made up of PR people, and the second panel will be made up of journalists. And they're all LGBTQ professionals, and they're all going to tell their personal stories, but also give insight, give advice, let us know how we can be advocates for them too, because there's a lot of people that are tired from advocating for themselves for so long, they need help. And maybe that's the role of the communicators, to answer those calls for help and to come together and help push messages forward that need to be brought forward.
That is a great point that you made, Jenny, too, is that and I think the number one talent of a public relations person is being a good listener first.
Absolutely.
To understand what someone else is trying to say. We do that day in, day out in our profession. But I think it would help us too if we stopped and listened to the people who have a story to tell, who, like you said, need help in telling it, because it's so important for our community. It's so important for the world that we live in. So that's really awesome. And that event, let's give it a plug, is coming up on June 29th.
June 29th, Tuesday, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. And you can register through our website, prmuseum.org. And it's going to be a great show.
Love it. I will, as soon as we're done taping here, I'm going to click and register myself. That's awesome. Well, this has been a terrific conversation and an enlightening one. We really appreciate you spending time with us. We are going to have a little bit of fun now and transition into our rapid fire question segment of our podcast. And this is the first time we've had two people doing rapid fire at once. So this will be interesting. And this is where we, as you know, steal a page from inside the actor studio. We ask just these simple questions designed to elicit a 1 or 2 word answer, just your gut reaction to whatever you hear. So with your indulgence, let's begin. Rapid fire question number 1, your favorite news source?
New York Times.
I was going to say New York Times also.
All right. Rapid fire question number 2, what is your favorite social media platform?
Instagram.
Instagram and Facebook, same company.
Now it is.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Rapid fire question number 3, coffee or alcohol?
Coffee.
Oof. Depends on the time of day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
I don't drink, so it's always coffee.
it's 50-50.
I'm with you. And Jenny, I'm with you. I don't drink either, but in the days that I did, woof. Rapid fire, right? You can definitely use it. Rapid fire question number 4. What is your favorite on the run food? This is from my days as a reporter, but go ahead.
I would say back before COVID, if it was on the run, it would be a slice of pizza.
Agreed.
If I was in the city, but not in Jersey, it would have to be Manhattan or Brooklyn.
This is going to be posh, but a fresh squeezed juice.
Nice. That'll pick you up. Absolutely. And rapid fire question number 5, what do both of you want to be after you finish this career?
Oof. I don't think I'm ever finishing this career. I think I'm going to die in the museum one day from exhaustion. I can't imagine doing anything else because our roles are changing, evolving, becoming more important, more relevant. And I want to see the museum continue to grow as large and as significant as it possibly can. And I'll be there until the last minute.
I think I chose PR because I knew that I could apply it to any industry. So I never thought, oh, I'm going to be this after I finish. I always had a tendency to try different fields out, but PR definitely gives me the opportunity to apply myself everywhere. But if I didn't eat bunny, I would be a pop star.
Oh, there you go.
So after I finish PR, if I finish PR, I would definitely love to be a singer.
But aren't we all pop stars? Come on, in our own minds.
Well, we are going to have a PR's Got Talent fundraising show.
Oh, there you go.
So if you'd like to live out your dreams of being a pop star, stay tuned for more information on that. That's a little spoiler.
Look at you, the event promoter that we all are. That's so great.
Right.
Good for you. Good for you.
Training.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. Please let people know how they can find you online.
Sure. You can visit our website at prmuseum.org. On Instagram, we are at PR Museum. On Twitter, we are at Museum of PR. On LinkedIn and Facebook, you can find us at Museum of Public Relations. And yeah.
If people want to reach out to you individually, do you have a preferred social media platform?
I would say Facebook, LinkedIn.
Instagram at Jenny Frenkel.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Well, thanks to the both of you. Appreciate it. And I'm going to publicly pledge my support of the Museum of Public Relations right here. We can talk after we hit the record button on how I can get involved, because I'd really love to do it. Thank you, Shelley and Jenny, for your time here. Thanks everyone for listening too. Remember to subscribe to the show. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the PR Podcast, and send us a question or a comment. Our intro is by Christopher Appold. You can find him and his fantastic photography on Instagram at Christopher_APPOLDT. Check him out and hire him for all your photography needs. You can find me online at Jody Fisher on all the socials, and online at jodyfisherpr.com. We'll see you next time on the PR Podcast.